Is Russia abandoning its dream of global power? For years, Russia has been projecting power far beyond its borders, from Africa to the Middle East and Latin America. In Africa, the Kremlin extends its influence predominantly through shadowy mercenaries rather than its own army. But that image just took a hit. In Mali, Russian fighters have been pushed out of the northern town of Kidal. This raises real questions about Moscow's reach.
I mean, to be brutally honest, Russia is not a global power. It is no longer a superpower.
And if Russia can't sustain its global posture, what does it become? Mark Galeotti is a professor at University College London. He's widely considered to be one of the leading Western experts on Russia and Vladimir Putin's system of power.
Yes, I mean, there's around 2,000 Russian mercenaries there supporting the Malian government against both jihadist and Tuareg separatist militants. And what became clear is that this weekend, those two very, very different and in many ways rival anti-government forces nonetheless launched a coordinated series of attacks. We had a truck bombing that killed the Malian defense minister, for example. But in particular, there was a focused drone-supported ground assault on this crucial town of Kidal, which was being defended by both Malian government and Russian mercenary forces. And, well, if you believe the Russian account, they decided in order to save civilians' lives to organize an orderly retreat. In practice, it's clear that they were actually pushed out of the town, in part because the Malian forces essentially broke and ran, but in part also because they just really weren't anticipating this kind of ferocity and scale of attack.
Mali was supposed to be a showcase. Russian mercenaries had taken Kidal 3 years ago. They raised their flag over the town. Now they've been forced out in humiliating fashion. Back in Moscow, the news is being read as much more than just a bad week in Africa.
Yeah, it is an embarrassment indeed. And I think that it's going to give more ammunition to those people back in Moscow who are actually saying, look, our Africa venture, it made sense at the time, but in the post-Ukraine invasion context, it's actually a distraction. It's a diversion. I mean, it's meant to, after all, distract the West, and it did at first. But these days, it's really more of a vulnerability for us. Those soldiers, that military equipment could be better used closer to home. So we can anticipate there's going to be much more of a debate precisely on how much resource Russia puts into its kind of global adventures. And as we've already seen, essentially them withdrawing to a degree from Venezuela, from Cuba and the like, I can't help but feel that we're going to see a certain drawdown from Africa in the longer term too.
To understand why Mali matters, you have to go back. Russia didn't get into this African mission with its army, but rather with one man and a private business that worked precisely because the Kremlin could pretend it had nothing to do with it.
Initially, technically speaking, it wasn't the Russian state that was involved. It was the Wagner mercenary organization run by Yevgeny Prigozhin. Now, of course, in practice, this was independent in name only. It was a deniable instrument of the Kremlin. And from the Kremlin's point of view, its adventures in Africa really had several perspectives. One was it was an opportunity to try and earn some revenue. I mean, after all, these are mercenaries. They're not fighting just for the joy of it. They're fighting because they're paid. Secondly, it was a way of trying to kind of distract and, if need be, sort of, in effect, troll the West. I mean, it's quite striking, particularly the degree to which the French became especially incensed when the Russians just sort of slotted in after them in Francophone, French-speaking parts of Africa.
Then, Prigozhin attempted a mutiny in Moscow. 2 months later, his plane fell out of the sky. Wagner was then absorbed into the Russian state and rebranded as Africa Corps. But by the time the new outfit took over, the Kremlin had a bigger problem.
The Ukraine war is absolutely sucking in all of Russia's resources, political, economic, as well as military. We have something like 95% of the Russian field force that is available for deployment is deployed in and around Ukraine. And the need to maintain that commitment is essentially distorting the Russian economy, which is sliding into stagnation precisely because of the need to continue to fund the war.
So Africa had to take a back seat, and so did Russian operations elsewhere. The Kremlin couldn't take chances.
So in some ways, everything else is allowed to slide. The Americans go in and essentially kidnap Maduro from Venezuela. The Russians just simply provide some sort of token political opposition, but that's it. Iran, we see one of Russia's allies being hammered by American and Israeli forces. The Russians will provide a bit of intelligence support and the like, but that's about it. So generally speaking, Putin is pulling his horns in. Putin is actually focusing on Ukraine, and whatever else is going on, it can kind of run to a degree on autopilot. But the point at which it would require extra resources, and this is the thing about Mali, to really be able to reverse the tide, the Russian commanders there are saying that we need more men, we need more equipment. Well, no, that's not on the cards. Everything must be sacrificed, if need be, for the conflict in Ukraine.
This takes us back to our opening question. If Russia can't defend its allies in Africa, if it can't intervene when its partners are taken in Latin America, then what is it in geopolitical terms?
I mean, to be brutally honest, Russia is not a global power. It is no longer a superpower. Sure, it does have a nuclear arsenal, but beyond that rather niche capability to blow up the world, in effect, that is only of limited value. Russia is, shall we say, an effective regional power, a middle power in many ways. It's not America, it's not China. Now, what it means for its policy in regions like Africa is it's going to be less able to actually defend clients and sort of throw its weight around in the way we used to superpowers. It can still forge alliances, though. The Russians are often quite clever in their diplomacy. They're able to play on anti-Westernism. But, as I say, this is influence building on the cheap. It's essentially about just simply playing what cards they are given, rather than actually being in a position to spend much in the way of aid, let alone to send troops and tanks.
So rather than retreating on the world stage, Russia is changing its posture. The question is, what comes next?
I think it will primarily be projecting itself in political ways, and that will be both overt and covert. Overt, it'll be precisely presenting itself as the sort of the voice and the champion of the global South against the interests of the sort of hegemonic West and increasingly sort of rapacious China. And covertly, it will carry on its operations in terms of disinformation, supporting particularly useful political movements and the like. When it comes down to it, keeping a mercenary army in the field is very expensive. Just simply supporting a few convenient politicians and maybe bribing the odd media outlet, that is relatively cheap. And that's the kind of thing that the Russians do have a tendency to do really rather well.
In other words, the version of Russia that operated everywhere, propping up regimes, appears to be going home. What's left will be a cheaper, possibly quieter version. It might be harder to detect, and in some ways, harder to deter. We want to hear your thoughts too. Is this a temporary setback or a sign that Russia's era as a global power is reaching its limits? Give us your take in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching.